B'déimre atá sibh a chuirde. Sin bháltain seo a chur forainn fáilte romh ag an cid seo de Clark Avery RSí Canja. Ní féidir len sibh seo thuairt isteach ag RSí Canja, mar sin tá mo déine a chur Clark Avery RSí Canja thugamh ar na man socialta. How are you folks? Shana Walsh here, manager of RSC Canja, and I am introducing this particular section of the winter programme. I hope you enjoy it. We can't bring you in here to enjoy the winter programme, so we are bringing the winter programme to you on social media.
Pádraig Ó to this talk on Hans Litten, the left-wing lawyer who put Hitler on the stand. Many of you will be familiar with the image on the left-hand side of the screen. It's perhaps one of the most infamous faces of the 20th century, if not the history of the world. But not too many will recognise the face on the right-hand side. That is the face of Hans Litten, a 28-year-old lawyer who was only practising 2.5 years when he summons perhaps the greatest orator of his era to a Berlin court in 1931. Their duel in the courtroom would be one of the most precarious and dangerous moments in Hitler's rise to power. So who was this young lawyer who had a short but extraordinary legal career? And I want to start with his family background. Hans Litten was born in 1903 in Germany. He had a very privileged upbringing. His mother was from a long line of Lutheran pastors and university professors. His father was a law professor at the University of Königsberg, and the Litten household played host to the elite in Prussian society as he grew up. You'll see there from the photograph his father in military attire. He fought in the First World War and was awarded the Iron Cross first and second class post. Religion would play an important part in Hans Litten's life. His father was part of the rising Jewish middle class in the late 19th century. He, though, converted to Lutheranism as he was a social climber. He realised that he would not make it into the elite of Prussian society if he remained a Jew. Hans, though, kept his Jewish heritage. As his friend Max first said, he wanted to be a Jew. He stood on the side of the downtrodden. So he met Max first in the Jewish youth movement group, and this group had very socialist revolutionary ideas, and that was very formative in Litten's development in these years. So Hans Litten also learned Hebrew, and some historians have theorised that he kept his Jewish heritage to rebel against his father. He was a very reluctant law student. He was more keen in art and acquired this interest and also an interest in humanitarian and social justice issues from his progressive-minded mother. His father had big ideas of him becoming a lawyer and compromised with him and allowed him to study art with law at Königsberg University. He attended his father's lectures and, much to the amusement of students, debated legal points with his father in the lecture hall. And there's no doubt that he was shaped by the political developments of his time. He had a passionate interest in German politics. And around that time, you had the German Revolution in 1918-19 and the murders of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, two heroes of the left. His father soon regretted encouraging him to do law. He qualified in 1928. He had offers from German Justice Ministry and prosperous private practices, but he didn't intend to follow his father into that area of law. He established instead Litten and Barbasch office in Berlin. Ludwig Barbasch was a radical lawyer who formerly worked with Karl Liebknecht. They took on Red Aid cases for little or no fee. Red Aid was an organisation who represented socialist protesters who had been arrested for their political actions. It also supported their wives and family. Litton was no fan of the Weimar Republic. In fact, he was a very radical socialist lawyer, and he was critical of the Social Democratic Party and communist leadership. He would soon get a chance to challenge the SDP in court. In Berlin in 1928, December 1928, in fact, there was a ban on political demonstrations, and at that time the Social Democratic Party was the dominant party in Berlin. The police chief was appointee of that party, Karl Zorbibel, and the Communist Party decided to defy the ban and organised a political demonstration for May Day in Berlin in 1929. The police fired indiscriminately into the crowd and brutally suppressed the demonstration. 33 people were killed and over 300 were arrested for breach of the peace. An investigation into the police action was stayed. Litton himself was injured during the demonstration when he went to the assistance of a protester and at one point was fired at later in that day. So here are two images of the Berlin police on that May Day, 1929. Litton defended many of those who were arrested by police. He took a private prosecution. This was a familiar tactic of Litton against the police chief for the murder of 33 demonstrators. His focus was on the legality of the police actions rather than the behaviour of the individual officers. And he argued in court that if the police action was illegal, then the police chief was liable for the murder of the 33 people. This indictment was rejected by the state prosecutor, and this was upheld at the Court of Appeal. However, the case earned him the lasting hatred of the Berlin police. He then moved his focus to the rise of Nazism after the Great Depression. He waged a legal battle against the Nazi Party. He was a frequent speaker outside of the court at public events. He also contributed to left-leaning periodicals around this time. His most high-profile case was the case where he summoned Hitler to the court, and this was the Eden Dance Hall trial. He intended to use this case to show how the Nazis used terror to destroy the democratic structures of the Weimar Republic. Before we go on to talk about that trial, I just want to go back and speak about Hitler's view of lawyers. He held them in very low regard. He referred to them as traitors, idiots, and absolute cretins. In 1942, he vowed to make every German realise that it was a disgrace to be a lawyer. He would have been furious, no doubt, to be held to account by this young and brilliant Jewish lawyer. Hitler's role for lawyers in Nazi Germany was to be part of the fighting force of the Third Reich, not defending political opponents. The political background of the trial is also important. Hitler had concluded that he could only gain power through democratic means and elections which he despised after the failure of the beer hall coup in 1923. So he begins to target communist and SDP strongholds in Berlin. And the photo you see there on the screen is the Communist Party headquarters in Berlin. In the 1930 elections, the Communist Party had 27.3% of the vote in Berlin, the SDP 27.2%, and the Nazis trailing behind only in 14.6%. So you can see why they targeted the working class vote if they had any ambitions of coming to power. Beer taverns at that time were very important in working class German culture, and the strategy of the Nazis was to take control of these, and these became known as storm taverns. And the SA, Hitler's SA, became the instrument of terror in doing that. The Old Tavern in Berlin was frequented by Storm 33, an infamous unit of the SA, who were otherwise known as Murder Storm. On the 22nd of November 1930, they had attacked the Eden Dance Hall. They had alleged that two of their members were assaulted outside this hall earlier in that evening, and 20 members left the Old Tavern, forced entry to Eden Dance Hall, and shots were fired. 3 men were wounded. The wounded socialist retained Litten to bring a private prosecution. He then summons Hitler as a witness, and the stage was set. Hitler had a bit of a dilemma going into this trial. The Berlin SA leader, Walter Steins, again you see Walter Steins' image here on the screen, he was uneasy with Hitler's electoral strategy. The SA radicals sat uneasy with the legalism of the Nazi leadership. He wanted the SA to be independent of the Nazi Party, and there was an open revolt in 1930 when the SA refused to act as bodyguards for the Nazi electoral candidates after their members were left off the ballot roll. So Hitler had a very uneasy dance. He wanted to woo the middle class and the working class vote in Germany, and he also had to throw some red meat to the SA as well. And this trial was pretty dangerous for him. It opened him up to the danger of a criminal prosecution for perjury. It also had the potential to split the Nazi Party if he rejected the SA in cross-examination, and it could also publicly expose the contradictions of the Nazi project. Hitler was called on the 8th of May 1931 and took the stand. Litton, in cross-examination, alleged that Storm 33 was a roll commando. Roll commando were units within the SA set up deliberately to murder people. He also alleged that the violence of the SA was authorised by the Nazi Party leadership. Hitler, in cross-examination, rejected violence. He stated that the SA served to protect the Nazi Party against terror from the left and for propaganda functions. He stated that the National Socialists were fundamentally legal, which was a lie. Litton was very calm and measured. Hitler grew increasingly frustrated in the cross-examination by Litton. Goebbels, Hitler's director of propaganda, had produced a pamphlet in 1927 for recruits. It stated that if Nazis did not get power through electoral means, that they would make revolution. Litton asked Hitler if he knew about this pamphlet, and Hitler denied any knowledge of it. Litton then referred to Goebbels' appointment as party boss in Berlin a year before the pamphlet, and the fact that he wasn't disciplined, and further he was promoted director of propaganda. This infuriated Hitler. And you'll see here that there's an excerpt from the trial. The Goebbels pamphlet was Litton's ace card. The cross-examination at this point was a very dangerous moment for Hitler, but he was saved by the judge, as you can see from this interaction here. So Hitler challenged Litton that his allegation was an invitation to illegality, and that was a statement without proof. Litton replied, "How is it possible that the party publishing house takes over a journal that stands in stark contrast to the party line?" The presiding judge then intervened. "That doesn't have anything to do with this trial." So Hitler was saved, but he was wounded. He would never forget his ordeal. Litton's last big case against the Nazis was the Falstaff trial. And you can see here in the photograph, Litton outside the court with some of the defendants in that case. In January 1932, a Nazi gang, around 150 of them, rampaged through the Falstaff colony. This colony was heavily populated by left-wing workers. In fact, they had been escorted by the police to the colony and were met by members of the Combat League Against Fascism. 2 people were killed, Ernst Schwarz, a Berlin SA, and Fritz Klemke, who was a communist. Red Aid had briefed Litton to defend residents, 19 of those who were on trial, and to bring a private prosecution against Klemke's killer. Litton argued at this trial that Berlin police had colluded with the SA, and he had some evidence of this. Franz Schwarz, who was a defendant, his wife had an affair with a man with ties to Red Aid, and she had disclosed to him that the gun used by the SA in the murder had come from police. Litton was informed of this. The police officer was challenged at court, denied it. He later attempted suicide and had a nervous breakdown. The judge and prosecution, according to Litton, were out to get him. And it's clear to see why he came to that conclusion. The chief prosecutor in the case sent a memo to senior official and referred to Litton as a dangerous irritant on the administration of justice. Litton was also expelled from the trial by the judge. This expulsion was set aside by the Court of Appeal, but Litton was barred from the second Falstaff trial. There were no legal grounds for expelling Litton from the trial, and the first one was set aside on that basis. So Litton had made many enemies in his short legal career, including the police, judges, prosecutors, and the SA. Rudolf Olden, a lawyer in Berlin, had referenced that the Berlin bar were too passive in defence of Litton. There were attempts to prosecute him. He was routinely threatened by the SA and had to have the assistance of bodyguards from the Combat League Against Fascism. He was refused a handgun permit, and his mother begged him to leave Germany. He refused to leave, stating that the millions of workers cannot get out, so I must therefore stay here as well. The Reichstag fire was a key moment in German history, but it was also a seminal event in Litton's life. Hitler came to power in Germany the 30th of January 1933. On the 27th of February, the Reichstag Parliament building was burnt down. Historians disagree about the cause of the fire. Was it the lone figure, a Lee Harvey Oswald figure, the Dutch anarchist Marnus, or was it a ruse by Nazis to crack down on opponents? What is true, however, is that over 5,000 Social Democratic Party and Communists were arrested. A number of lawyers, including Hans Litten, were also arrested. He was taken from his home at 4 a.m. and taken into protective custody. Later that same day, Hitler signed the Reichstag decree suspending civil liberties and retrospectively legalising the previous night's arrest. The decree also legalised imprisonment without trial. Hans Litten was effectively interned. Litten was then taken to Spandau Municipal Prison before being moved to a concentration camp. The Reichstag Fire Decree was a very draconian piece of legislation. I've highlighted some of the key parts of that decree. It basically stated that it was permissible to restrict the rights of personal freedom, habeas corpus, freedom of expression, including the freedom of the press, the freedom to organise and assemble, the privacy of postal, telegraphic and telephonic communications, warrants for house arrest, orders for confiscation, as well as restrictions on property are also permissible beyond legal limits otherwise prescribed according to the decree. I just wanted to digress for a moment. Whilst Litton was in custody, Jewish lawyers on the outside also became a target for the Nazis, and they used the law to eliminate the Jewish lawyers. In 1933, 43% of lawyers in Berlin were of Jewish origin. It was a chosen profession due to historical discrimination. The Equality Act of 1871 opened up universities for Jews. Many of them decided to pursue a legal profession. After Hitler came to power, the National Socialists unleashed their venom on these Jewish lawyers. And the exclusion of Jewish lawyers took place in various stages after the initial arrest following the Reichstag fire. There was initial terror when SA attacked courthouses and forced Jewish lawyers and members of staff to leave the buildings. This began on the 9th of March at Görlitz District Court. This mood inflamed after the boycott on the April the 1st of National Socialists of Jewish businesses, including law firms. You can see here in the photograph 2 SA members standing outside Jewish law offices in Berlin. They then moved to statutory and bureaucratic measures. On the 31st of March, Kerr's decree stated that Jewish judges had to take a leave of absence. Only certain Jewish attorneys could practice law. Only a week later, a supplementary order referred to Jewish attorneys making an application for admission to the bar together with a statement of allegiance to the government. On the 10th of April 1933, there was an occupational ban for all non-Aryan attorneys, except if already admitted before 1914, and they became known as elderly attorneys, and combat veterans and direct relatives. By October 1933, 588 out of a total of 1,800 Jewish lawyers were refused practice in Berlin. So many still practiced, but under very difficult circumstances. However, there was an occupational ban at this stage for female Jewish lawyers. There were only 19 of them in 1933, perhaps 1% of the bar. They weren't allowed to obtain degrees until 1921 and didn't serve frontline World War I. So these measures already introduced excluded all of them. There was one exception, and it's the image, the woman on the screen, and that's Hannah Katz. She's the only German representative on the board of International Law Association. The Nazis didn't want an English representative replacing her, so they allowed her to practice. She fled Germany around 1941. So they then moved to economic sanctions against the remaining Jewish lawyers. The income was a target. In May the 23rd, 1933, law firms with Jewish and non-Jewish partnerships dissolved. The non-Jewish partner usually took the clients. They were prohibited from doing legal aid work. Major economic associations and companies terminated contracts. And as Siegfried Neumann, a Berlin lawyer, said, the racial question has turned out to be a financial one. And the final wave of exclusion occurred in 1938, when all Jews lost their admission to practice law on the 30th of November of that year. So the remaining 674 Jewish lawyers were banned and were only permitted to act as legal consultants. They were second-class legal professionals. They weren't allowed to wear robes. or use lawyers' rooms and courtrooms, but they were permitted only for the purposes of legal consultation and representation of Jews. So just some staggering, shocking statistics about lawyers in Berlin, or Jewish lawyers. When Hitler came to power, there was 1,835. 299 of those died at the hand of Nazis, 188 in concentration camps, 107 survived the camps, 28 committed suicide, 703 emigrated, 56 were exiled and returned, and 206 died of natural causes. Back to Hans Litten. He was detained in various concentration camps over the next number of years. On the 6th of April 1933, he moved to Sonnenberg concentration camp, which was guarded by the infamous Storm 33 members. Here, not surprisingly, he suffered very serious leg injuries, a cracked jaw, lost sight in one eye, and teeth knocked out. One prisoner recalled how he had begged one of the guards to take his life. He was moved on the 25th of April to Spandau, which is a more humane concentration camp. He was allowed a weekly food parcel and to wear his own clothes. However, he was tortured here as well. He was forced to break the lawyer-client privilege when he confessed under torture to his client in Pfalzneck, admitting that he had stabbed an SA member. This caused him great anguish. He was a very principled lawyer, and after this event, he attempted suicide. He also spent some time at Esterwegen and Lichtenberg concentration camp. He still resisted the Nazis, even when he was in these camps. At Lichtenberg, prisoners were ordered to celebrate a Nazi event. Litton chose to recite a poem he learnt in his days in the youth movement. And this is the poem you'll see on the screen, titled "My Thoughts Are Free." A prisoner described the scene, and I'll quote, "Consider, all around black uniforms, thugs up front standing on a small platform, a poor, crippled, tormented man. He suddenly reads a poem that in the context has an oppositional, no, a revolutionary and incendiary effect." So you can imagine the faces of the Gestapo officers as Hans Litten very bravely read out this poem. Hans' mother, Ingrid, campaigned tirelessly for his release. She lobbied Crown Prince Wilhelm and President Hindenburg. The Crown Prince spoke to Hitler about Hans Litten. Hitler lost his temper and stated, "Anyone who speaks on behalf of Litton gets thrown into a camp, even if it's you." She also petitioned Göring and Himmler, who were senior Nazis. Fritz Litton, his father, made a half-hearted plea to Hitler in 1935. Ingrid Litton then turned her attention to Lord Allan in 1935. He was a very interesting character. He was a pacifist who was jailed 3 times for conscientious objections to World War I. He was an influential Labour peer and friend of the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. He had a good relationship with the German ambassador to Britain, von Ribbentrop. And this was perhaps Litton's last hope of release. Lord Allan travelled to Germany in January 1935 and met with Hitler. It's likely that he raised Litton's plight. We don't have confirmation of that, there's no proof of it, but it's highly likely that he spoke about this case. In October 1935, he addressed a petition to Hitler, signed by more than 100 distinguished barristers and public servants. That plea was rejected. Von Ribbentrop, you can see here on the screen, replied on Hitler's behalf and deemed Litton as one of the intellectual leaders of German communism. Litton would be moved to Dachau concentration camp in 1937. This was the first Nazi concentration camp, and again he was savagely beaten here. The camp was no longer for political opponents. All of these were nearly gone in Nazi Germany, but it was now for undesirables such as Jews after the Nuremberg laws. He was moved to Jew Block 8, which housed all of the Jewish prisoners. The death of Heinz Eschen, a friend of Litton's in prison, had a dramatic effect on him. He was murdered by prison guards, and Litton was heard to say after finding out about his death that "Tonight I will be together with Heinz." He had also previously told prisoners that he would give it 5 years in custody. He was found hanged in a cell on the 5th of February 1938. Whilst his mother disputed that it was suicide in her campaign in subsequent years, it is highly likely that it was. Whilst the essay may not have killed Litton, 5 years of torture drove him to this position, no doubt. He was cremated and buried at Wilmersdorf Cemetery. His mother, Ingrid, was the sole mourner. His remains were later moved to Cemetery Pankow in Berlin. Litton paid the ultimate price for his cross-examination of Hitler. He often talked about the double edge of the deed, the consequences for himself and his family for being a human rights lawyer in Germany in the 1930s. And there's no doubt his friends and family were exposed to mortal danger as well as he was. His mother left Germany 10 days after his death. She was warned of his pending arrest by a Gestapo officer. She wrote a book about her experiences and her campaign in 1940. She moved eventually to Britain during the war and denounced the Nazis regularly on BBC. She returned to West Germany after the war and was regarded as a traitor for leaving during the Second World War. She was denied her husband's pension at the university. She moved to East Germany and received a pension there as a victim of fascism. She died in 1953. Hans' brothers Heinz and Rainer would also be driven from promising theatrical careers in Germany as well. Fritz, Hans Litton's father, remained in Germany for a further period. The marriage was very strained. He also suffered for his son's actions. He was pursued for tax evasion and had to resign his post at Königsberg University. He was hounded by the press and his health declined. He fled to Czechoslovakia and then moved to the north of Ireland in 1939. He died at Thompson Memorial Hospital, or Home for Incurables in Lisbon, in February 1940 and was buried at Lisbon Cemetery. Interestingly, Ingrid and one of her sons did not attend the funeral. The newspaper on your screen comes from the newsletter, which is a report of his funeral. There were also obituaries in the newsletter and Belfast Telegraph that week. It was reported in local media here that he took with him to Ireland a signed copy of a photo of the Crown Prince. He clearly liked to tell people that in a previous life he was part of the elite of Prussian society. Of note in the funeral report, it refers to a representative from the Belfast Committee for German Refugees attending the funeral. This is probably a clue as to how he ended up in the north of Ireland. So, how is Litton remembered? Post-war, he was more acceptable to the East than the West, although he was still controversial in the East. He rejected Stalinism and criticised German communists for following the Moscow line. However, in East Berlin, the magistrate renamed Frederick Street Hans Litton Street. There's a plaque and a bus to Litton at Berlin Courthouse. By the late 1970s, there was a renaissance of criminal defence lawyers in West Germany. This is a response to the repressive approach by German authorities to the Red Army guerrilla campaign. Litton's name begins to appear in legal journals. In the 1980s, the German Association for Democratic Lawyers for Democracy awarded their human rights praise and honour of him. And significantly, in 2001, the German Bar Association head office was named Hans Litton House. And you see there a photograph of myself outside Hans Litton House in February this year, just shortly before lockdown. So what is Hans Litton's legacy? Hans Litton's story is about the descent of the rule of law in Germany in the early 1930s and its consequences. But it also serves as a warning to us today with the rise of right-wing populist regimes in Europe and throughout the world. In recent years, we have had the rule of law come under attack in Britain, the US and other places. In recent months, the British government have openly boasted about breaking international law through the provisions of the Internal Market Bill. They have brought forward legislation to protect soldiers overseas from committing crimes. Their election manifesto also includes an aspiration to withdraw from the provisions of the Human Rights Act. Attacks and hostile language by the British government on lefty activist lawyers, as they call them, in recent weeks and months has moved 802 former judges, barristers, solicitors and legal academics to call for the British Prime Minister and Home Secretary to apologise. Of course, this jurisdiction, we have seen the dangerous polemic against lawyers can lead to. We have lost two of our bravest human rights lawyers, Pat Finucane and Rosemary Nelson. Trump in the US has campaigned on a promise of law and order without the rule of law. He has attacked almost daily the media and the judiciary. He has energised and given cues to right-wing militias, his own version of the SA soldiers. As Tom Bingham, former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, has said in his book The Rule of Law, the hallmarks of a regime which flouts the rule of law are the knock on the door in the middle of the night, the sudden disappearance, the subjection of prisoners to ill treatment, the confessions extracted by torture, eventually the concentration camp, the gulag, the practice of aggressive war, genocide and ethnic cleansing. The Nazi regime was not the first nor the last authoritarian regime to use democratic means to gain power and draconian laws to destroy political opponents to retain power. It is a precarious time indeed for human rights and the rule of law. The typical form of government now is electoral autocracy, where there are still elections, but the underlying conditions, including independent judiciary and a free media, are under assault. Electoral autocracies have doubled since 1972. We have witnessed in recent years the breakdown of many liberal democracies. Fentanyl too, the Irish journalist writing in the Irish Times 2 weeks ago, referred to Trump not as an exception, but as a great exemplar of political change in the 21st century. It is too early to tell if his defeat will alter this trajectory and bring in a new era of radical change. We shouldn't take it for granted. Hans Litten will be remembered as a proponent of the rule of law, but he should also be remembered for his revolutionary politics. He wasn't the average lawyer. He chose the difficult and less financially rewarding path of representing those most marginalised in Germany. He done so out of a deep passion for social justice. Outside the court, he advocated for a better and more equal society. And inside the courtroom, he used the law to expose and warn of the impending rise of fascism. Litton died fighting human rights abuses and exposing the brutality of Nazism. His death can be avenged by continuing that fight against fascism, racism and human rights abuses wherever they arise. We need more Hans Littons now than ever. Turn